May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Words matter. Never forget. It'll become more important later. But words matter. This is an anniversary of sorts. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm the other Canon Green. You've got Canon Martin Green and then me. And 6 months ago tomorrow, I was preaching here the last time. And about 4 days after that, my wife, Susan Deacon Green, who's also here, came within breaths of dying. And the retirement that I was just beginning, and I think I spoke to you a little bit about having a month of retirement under my belt, that kind of got put on hold. And now Susan is back with us, and everything is really proceeding along quite well. So that's an anniversary. A year ago this weekend, the Tree of Life Synagogue, which is home to a total of 3 different synagogues, was attacked, and a fellow killed 11 people there. About 7 months ago, a gunman attacked the Al-Nur Mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, killed 51 people. 4 years ago, a gunman went to a Wednesday night Bible study at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 11 people. There's all sorts of anniversaries to think about. The issue with the Tree of Life Synagogue, I would happen to listen to NPR. Does anybody else here listen to NPR? Every once in a while? There's a couple subscribers, perhaps. And a fellow who was there that day, who called 911 from a storeroom when the shooting began, had not been back to his synagogue since. So this was back in May that he actually made this visit. And he described what it was like to go back into that place and to encounter the spaces that had not just been sacred spaces, but there had been this sense of family. There is that sense of him talking about the 93-year-old man who always wore a suit, tie, and nice slacks every Sabbath for worship. And the fellow who was going back for his visit, he said, I was always very casual. I never dressed up at all. He said, but now I kind of made a promise to Max that I'm gonna really dress up. And I've been faithful to that. Whenever I go to synagogue, I'm always doing that in honor of Max. And this fellow talked about what it meant to try to go back. And that Tree of Life Synagogue, the community there, came up with a t-shirt. And evidently he was wearing one of those t-shirts. Being it was NPR, I couldn't see it. But I imagined the t-shirt, and I've now looked at it online. And the t-shirt said, words matter. Never forget. And there's a very brief explanation about it that you can read online. But it talks about how so many of these violent acts are preceded first by hateful speech. And that words do matter. And quite often, when we're at the place where we are beating our chests and wondering, how can this happen again? And we're thinking of how do we stop a shooter. We're not thinking about how do we stop the hate speech. How do we stop the things that we can stop? Now, some of you may have noticed in my previous visits, I wear this orange armband that I've been wearing for a couple years now. And in my former parish, I would occasionally don an orange stole for gun violence Sabbaths. I'm not sure if they do that here, but I've been very committed to this. And there was a period of about 2 weeks where I didn't have my orange band because it got cut off by mistake. And I didn't know what I was, so I was really into this idea of being against gun violence. And that triggered in me, get that? It triggered in me thought about the ways in which my speech did not take into account my very deeply held beliefs. I found so much of my language was full of references to setting a new goal and targeting it, or we're about ready to pull the trigger on a new whatever it might be. And there's all sorts of things. I was always looking for the silver bullet that was going to solve the problem. And I realized that though I, like perhaps many of you, felt totally powerless when it came to these incidents of violence, and I would often tell myself, well, we do have a gun, but it's the one that we don't even have a clip for, and it's been sitting in the cupboard for years. But I can't do anything about this. But I'd never even thought about my speech. And so I've begun very consciously paying attention to the ways that my speech actually promotes the idea that guns are an important and vital part of our culture. They are a meme about almost everything that we do. There's something related to guns. Now, rather than make this a 3-hour sermon, I'll just cut to the chase and say that when it comes to sexual violence, when it comes to all sorts of kinds of discrimination, there's all sorts of phrases that while we might decry ever being a part of any of those kinds of isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, we have our language that still is filled with all of those things. I began to start changing that. The reason that I bring this up is because in the gospel today, there are 3 layers of a story. And we're going to skip the first layer, which I think is Luke's deal. Whenever somebody has to tell you what the story you're about to hear means, you can probably assume that somebody got it wrong, so they decided they had to add that in because people were missing the point. And I don't know if it was Jesus' point or not. And then at the end, Jesus makes a point, which may or may not be the point that Jesus actually made. So I'd like to just think about the story. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. And one of them was a Pharisee. Now, as soon as I say Pharisee, I don't know about you, but my body kind of clenches a little bit, because I'm just sure that as Christians, Pharisees have often become our designated bad guy. They're to be the butt of jokes and things like that. And so I'm sure that this one is going to have a problem. That's not what the story says, but that's what the explanation says. And so the one of them is a Pharisee, and the other one is a tax collector, or as Penny pointed out earlier, a publican, which I guess she says is also a pub owner in Ireland. which I think is probably a great combo. And so I don't know of anybody who goes out of their way to start thinking good thoughts about tax collectors. And of course, tax collectors in those days were not like tax collectors now, where tax collectors pretty much we say, we're the IRS, send it in, and you do. In those days, they were tax farmers, and usually it was the biggest guy in the neighborhood, and he hired some of his best friend thugs who were told to collect 1,000, whatever the coin was, and if they got 2,000, they could keep it. So they did. So he's not a good fellow. The Pharisee, on the other hand, is not a bad fellow, probably a very honorable fellow. I can guarantee, since he talks about tithing everything, he would be right up here doing a message during stewardship time. And people will say, be more like the Pharisee, tithe. And so the explanation is one that we're kind of wondering what's going to happen. And Jesus says, the Pharisee began praying. And he began praying about, I am so glad I am not like other people. I'm not a rogue, I'm not a scallywag, I'm not a murderer, and I'm not even like this tax collector over here. I tithe everything, another plug for tithing. I fast twice a week. I probably could use more fasting myself. And he was incredibly self-satisfied. He wasn't a bad man, but he was quite proud of everything he had done, and God should be taking note. It's kind of like he got up in the pulpit here and led a cheer for himself. But the tax collector, standing far off, probably even outside the temple doors because he wasn't worthy or clean to enter because of the work that he did, won't even look up to heaven, but beats his chest, which is where liturgically probably this comes from for us, and says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, words matter. Did I say that before? Words matter. So if the words that I go up to the temple to pray are to let God know, hey, God, you and me, we got this. We're taking care of business, and I'm really doing great stuff. One might wonder, why did you need to come all the way up here to let me know that? On the other hand, the fellow who came from a place where he couldn't even consider himself worthy to look toward heaven, didn't consider himself worthy to engage with other people in this community of faith, and says, have mercy on me. Words have, I'm sure, hurt lots of people here. There are slurs, there are nicknames. I won't tell you what my father's nickname for me was. It isn't quite a 10:30 service kind of, or 10 o'clock service kind of nickname. But the church has been really responsible for giving a lot of nicknames to people that were shame-inducing, coming up with titles for people that were not ones that welcomed them into the community, but identified them as people to be avoided and people who were not fit for community. So I'm always anxious when I talk about sin and somebody saying, have mercy on me, a sinner, that people who are already have learned to feel ashamed and feel bad, feel like there's something wrong with them, will go out and say, see, the preacher told me I should even feel worse. That's not what I'm saying. And that's not what I think the scripture is saying. The tax collector knew who he was, and he knew that the only hope for him was God's mercy and God's love. And so he did his best to pay his tribute to that love and mercy. Words matter. Never forget. When we leave here today, are your words going to be words that participate in an industry, I would say cottage industry, but it's actually a global industry of shame, a global industry of exclusion? Or will your words be ones that invite people to participate in God's merciful, loving community, the beloved community? Will people be welcomed for who they are? Or will we get in line with everybody else and continue to make offhand comments that denigrate people who come from someplace else, who find themselves homeless, who might have the temerity to be part of a political party that we're not part of, or might even not listen to NPR? We have a choice. The choice is that our words matter. And as much as we can avoid words that harm and build a climate for hate and violence, we can also choose words that build up, that create love. And I have one last story. And the last story has to do with something that I learned in Palm Springs. Actually, it wasn't in Palm Springs when I learned it. But I was a member of the school board in Palm Springs. I was elected there twice. And I went to a school board convention. And one of the workshops that they had was put on by GLSEN, which is gay, lesbian, students, educator students. I don't remember what all the initials mean. I'm not good with initials. And the founder was trying to explain why it was important to have places for young people and teachers to go where they were safe. And he had a little, it was like a chart, it was like a bell curve, and there was an arrow. And so on the left-hand side was hate, exclusion, hurt, kill. And then in the middle was tolerance. Well, that struck me like a punch to the head, because I'd been trying all my life to be tolerant. I had been working for tolerance. If I found somebody who was different from me, I worked hard to tolerate them. And he said, how many of you would want to be married to somebody who merely tolerated you? I'm not asking how many of you are, And he said, on the other side of that curve, so we got hate here, tolerance in the middle, is love, acceptance, nurture. He says, that's what we're striving for. And all of a sudden I realized I had a long way to go. Our language can either be language that promotes killing and hurting, or it can be language that promotes love and inclusion and acceptance. Because wasn't it Jesus that said, love others as I have loved you? He didn't say, I think God will tolerate you. Words matter. Never forget.